I'm Samantha Overton, 34 years old. I arrived at my grandmother's house one night in late October without ringing the bell. Walter opened the door before I could finish knocking. His face was as white as chalk. He grabbed my sleeve, pulled me away from the door, and whispered words I can still hear in the night. "Get in quickly. Hide now." I opened my mouth to ask why. Then I heard the screech of tires on the gravel behind me, and my mother's car pulled into the driveway. I scrambled into the kitchen, into a tight space behind the cupboard. My grandfather didn't seem flustered. He looked like someone who had been waiting for me. During the next 40 minutes, I heard things that changed my view of my mother forever, and what she did next destroyed my family. Welcome to Quiet Drama Stories, where the silent find their voice and the truth always finds its way to the forefront. If stories of family, courage, and defending one's homeland touch your heart, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel. The aroma of cold coffee and aged wood wafts from behind the cupboard. I leaned my back against the wall and swayed. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest I was sure they could hear it. The front door opened without a knock. My mother's voice came first, clear and warm, in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Dad, it's just us. Don't get up." Footsteps passed through the living room. 2 more people followed me. I noticed Gerald's slow, heavy steps, the man I had married a year ago. The 3rd step was quick and easy. It was a woman I didn't know. Her heel brushed the wooden frame my grandmother was holding. I heard the sofa cushions creak as someone sat down. I heard my grandmother ask in a low, odd voice if anyone wanted tea. No one answered. Instead, the strange woman said, "It's all work," and placed something heavy on the coffee table. A thick stack of paper, making a soft, luxurious sound as it fell. "We'll make it easy, Walter," she said. "Just a few autographs today." My mother used to make that soothing sound. She used to do it when I was little and scared. He used to be a source of security for me. Now, a chill ran through my body. I trembled violently behind the cupboard, staring into the kitchen. I realized that what was happening in the living room wasn't just a visit, but a surgical procedure. My grandfather knew it was coming, and that's why he hid me. I didn't realize how serious it was. I had to go back because it was essential to know who had been standing in that room. My mother, Paula, is 57 years old, and she has managed our family my whole life like she's regulating the temperature. When it's hot, everyone relaxes. When it's cold, we all huddle together to warm up. I learned early on that peace has a price, and that price is often the one I pay. I'm a nurse, specializing in elderly care. I spend my days with people the age of my grandmother, reading their medical records and noticing subtle changes that families often miss. I know what it's like to be considered healthy. Her new husband, Gerald, was 60. He wore stylish shoes and didn't quite close his deals. I met him maybe 6 times. I'd never seen that woman wearing high heels before. It wasn't just the newspapers that worried me. 3 weeks ago, my grandfather stopped calling me on Sundays, as he had done for years, and I received a letter from the bank addressed to my mother. I remember calling the bank to ask why, because that's the standard procedure. They told me they weren't authorized to discuss someone else's account with me. I wasn't involved. I had no problem with it. I remember hanging up and telling myself that families always send messages. I wished I was completely wrong. As I knelt behind that warehouse, listening to a strange woman asking my grandfather to sign, I finally realized there was nothing to be afraid of. I'd arrived early and let him leave. That's the part I still can't forgive myself for. The strange woman explained it to me in a calm, professional voice. She said the paperwork would allow my mother to keep the things, so Walter wouldn't worry. She had a power of attorney. After he signed it, my mother was able to handle the bills, the accounts, everything. Then Gerald spoke in a low voice, which only made matters worse. He said the house was too big for one person. He added that there was a good place across the street, a nursing home, and that he would provide the best possible care after the house was sold. My grandfather asked in a low, hesitant voice what was happening in the garden. No one answered. My mother leaned forward, her voice dropping to the tone she used to express bitter truths. "Father, we're past this. You forget things now, for your own good." Then she said, "I'll listen to you until the day I die. He won't even remember Christmas." She said she would say, "Rain." Not cruel, exactly. Worse than cruel. Of course. I bit my wrist to shut up. My eyes burned. Through the crack, I saw the edge of my grandfather's chair, his hand resting on the armrest, and I saw that hand move, like a frightened old man trembling. Not steadily. He held a pen in his hand, writing something small and precise on a piece of paper placed on the side of the chair where they couldn't see it. My grandfather, the man I'd described as completely incapable of managing his own life, was quietly taking notes. My heart broke, and at the same time something else stirred within me. I didn't realize then that he wasn't the one who needed saving, but rather the one who had set the trap. In the following minutes, my grandfather put on a spectacular show, the likes of which I had never seen before. He forgot Gerald's name twice, calling him the boy who came from the bank. He repeated the same question about kindergarten 3 times in a row until my mother lost all patience. "Dad, please!" she cried angrily, and I heard the real Paula writhing in her warm robe, annoyed and impatient. The stranger tried to pick up the pen, but quickly dropped it to the ground, apologizing in a low, confused voice. I heard Gerald sigh, the sigh of someone who's seen the money arrive late. They decided he was too tired to sign today. My mother said they would come back when they had a better day at the weekend. I could hear the frustration in the room, thick as smoke. Then, as they gathered their coats and the stranger stuffed papers into his pocket, my grandfather did as I had told him, slowly turning his head from the kitchen to exactly where I was hiding. For a moment, his eyes weren't clouded at all. They were sharp, clear, and completely present. They spotted me in the darkness behind that cupboard, as if he knew exactly where I was. He shook his head slightly. "Be quiet, wait." Then the fog returned to his face, and he didn't ask anyone if it was dinner time. My hands were trembling. My grandfather wasn't confused. He pretended to be so kind-hearted that his daughter believed him. The question that filled my chest was simple, yet terrifying. How long had he been gone? He left the papers on the coffee table to read them. My mother kissed him on the head and told him to calm down. The front door closed, the car started, and the tires began screeching as it moved. I counted to 60, like I was counting in the dark during a storm, waiting to be sure. Then, in his real voice, calm and gentle, my grandfather said, "You can get out now, Sam." I got out on my trembling legs. He stood by the window, looking out at the empty driveway. He turned to me, looking 10 years younger and inexplicably tired. I asked him what was going on. He led me to a room that smelled of cedar wood and pencil sharpeners. He explained everything simply. Long ago, he had been an accountant in a small town, always the same. For months, he had suspected that Paula and Gerald were vandalizing the house. He feigned forgetfulness, so they took their customers and told him the whole plan, instead of telling them one by one. If I had told you your mother was doing this, you would have had reason to suspect me. You had to hear it for yourself. That's why he hid me, without panicking. The strategy, get in quickly. Hide now, niece. I'm the only nurse who can stop this so you can hear what's being said. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pushed the paper he'd been writing on during the dreadful meeting into my hand. On it, in handwriting as neat as an accountant's, was a name and a number. And that's where the story began. Wissam, your mother has a key to this house. She can come back any time. I sat at the kitchen table and let him explain the paperwork. Her name was Ruth Delgado, an attorney specializing in elderly cases who had handled my grandmother's cases decades ago when she was still alive. The number below wasn't a phone number, it was $18,000. This is what he said had been missing for 3 months. He noticed his account balance dwindling. Small expenses he'd never made. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. They were scattered so as not to arouse suspicion. When he contacted the bank, a new employee was assigned to help him, but he received no assistance. He stopped calling me on Sundays because Paula had started coming over on Sundays, and he didn't want her to know how close we were. Everything I had only partially seen and convinced myself I hadn't seen became crystal clear. There was no misunderstanding. There was a carefully crafted plan. The house he had built, his retirement savings accumulated over 4 decades, the small memorial fund he had set up in my grandmother's name, all were at stake, as was his honor, which he cherished so much. He said he wasn't afraid of death, but rather of hiding in his life, of going to the hospital, and of losing touch with the people who were supposed to love him. I glanced at the papers on the coffee table, then at the pen the stranger had left beside them as a test. I remembered my mother's voice. He wouldn't remember it until Christmas, and I made a decision I couldn't seem to make. I told him they weren't taking this house. He almost smiled. Then he said, "We have to hurry, he has the key." I'd been driving home for about 15 minutes, my hands gripping the car tightly, my mind racing. I supported my mother my whole life by relying on her. Not because I was weak, but because giving in was easier than confronting the situation. And now, the confrontation had come, whether I liked it or not. My usual response was to whisper, if I had kept quiet, none of this would have happened. But I knew the truth. I had seen this story from a different perspective at work, in letters and in family gatherings. I knew that the instinct for peace was exactly what should exist in situations like this. I couldn't sleep that night, so I did what nurses do. I did some research. What I found was appalling. The most common perpetrators of financial exploitation are the children of adults, not strangers they meet over the phone, not foreign scammers, but their own children. About 40% of the cases reported to federal regulators involve adult children abusing their parents. Once a power of attorney is signed, it is extremely difficult to revoke. If my mother had obtained that signature, she wouldn't have broken the law. She would have been acting legally in my grandfather's name, which would have given her permission. At 2 a.m, I sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook and began writing down everything I knew. The dates, the amounts, the messages sent, and the stranger who had it. My over-responsibility had always been my fault, my desire to protect what wasn't mine, and for once, that desire was justified. When the sky darkened, I had a plan that began with a phone call. I sat in my car in front of the house for a long time after they left. Part of me still wanted to believe I'd heard something wrong. If you've ever caught someone you love lying and couldn't get over it, you know what silence is. Follow along, because what my grandmother did next changed everything. Comment and subscribe to the site you're viewing. Ruth Delgado reminded me of my grandmother when I called out his name. "The smartest man in Bellhaven," Walter Rubens said, his voice warm and quick. "How so?" I told her the truth, and her warm tone turned serious and more important. She had spent 30 years at the Institute for the Defense of the Rights of the Elderly and had seen this machine in operation countless times. She explained the situation to me in simple terms. I had no peace of mind, which I appreciated. Until the official power of attorney was signed, the door remained open, yet closed. For it to remain open, 3 things were necessary. First, proof of his mental soundness through a certified medical evaluation so that no one could question his awareness of his actions. Second, we can record the money that has already been transferred, the withdrawals, the additional communications, everything. Third, we can report everything to Adult Protective Services and request a state investigation. But Samantha said in a low voice, if they're planning to sign this weekend, we're not talking about days, we're talking about weeks. Everything will be 10 times more difficult after it's signed. We're trying to invalidate a legal document, not just suspend it. I asked her what I could do now. She thought for a moment, then said, "You're a nurse. You know how competency assessments work. Get an assessment from someone you trust, someone who's officially certified." That's a hurdle they can't overcome because their whole plan is built on the lie that he's unqualified. If that were the case, the plan would have failed. I turned off the phone, wrote down a list of my tasks, and counted the hours. Not weeks, but days. My mother had a key to the door. That's when my work stopped being just a job and began to become a weapon. It wasn't the kind my mother used. She had faced guilt repeatedly. The messages were passed across the table to someone she said was too guilty to read them. My weapons were different, and that was the crux of the matter. I controlled the fraud. I controlled the paperwork. She wanted to declare my grandmother legally incapacitated in secret. I wanted the signature to be publicly verified by a qualified physician. I contacted Dr. Hill, a geriatrician I had worked with for 6 years. He was a very meticulous man, and he confirmed his findings himself. I told him what I had seen. I didn't hesitate. That Thursday, 2 days earlier, he had scheduled Walter for a comprehensive cognitive assessment. It wasn't just a courtesy call, nor a way to save time. It was a real test with real, reliable results. I explained this to my grandfather on the phone that night, and he was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, tell them I'm leaving. I'll take the test and prove I'm here." That was her tone. Now, my mother's entire plan was based on a claim she didn't understand what she was signing. If an honest doctor had written everything down exactly as he understood it, there would have been no room for her lies. I wouldn't have yelled at her. I wouldn't have begged her. I wanted to build a simple wall of reality that would prevent anyone from speaking about them in a friendly tone. I slept a little better that night, not much, because I kept thinking about how we missed the opportunity to sign the keys at the end of that week, and how people would move quickly, like my mother, when they felt they were being watched. My mother called me the next morning, and her voice was so warm. That was the first sign of trouble. She only ever sounded that sweet when she wanted something. "My dear," she said, "I've always wanted to talk about your grandfather. He's been running away from her, breaking her heart, and she and Gerald have been trying to protect themselves." She said she would hate for him to sign a bad contract or be cheated. Her sarcasm almost made me laugh, but I could hear the real question in her voice. She wanted to know what I knew. I had previously longed to reassure her, to lighten the mood, to make her feel supported so she could make the decision without conflict. As usual, I felt nauseous. I swallowed. "It's very sad," I told my mother. I said nothing more. She was calm. I showed her no confidence. There was a short silence from her, as if she were reconsidering. Then, as usual, she mentioned my grandfather's 80th birthday at the end of the month. The whole family was coming. The neighbors, the priest, everyone. "It'll be wonderful," she said simply. But there was a weight in her words. She was bringing in an audience. Whatever she was going to do, she wanted to do it in front of people, to make it seem like a mutual agreement, not a robbery. Thinking the party was going well, I stopped it before anyone could hear me. Then I sat down very quietly. She changed the date. She changed it to her birthday, not the weekend. She wanted witnesses. It turned out to be more serious than I feared, because she had imagined what it would be like. I took my grandfather to the bank on Wednesday. He wanted to change his mailing address to his home and get a printed statement of all his transactions for the past 6 months. Simple, reasonable things a person can do with their own money. We sat across from a young banker named Trevor, who stared at the screen with an uneasy expression as time passed. My grandfather politely asked why the conversation was being directed to his daughter's address. Trevor said he had been asked to change his name. Grandpa asked who had authorized Gerald to be added as a signatory to one of his accounts. Trevor looked closely. The change was written on a limited power of attorney Renata had given him a few weeks earlier, ostensibly to help manage the account. The power of attorney had been handed to him personally, along with a familiar signature card authorizing the banking transaction. Technically, everything was fine. It was there. I always try to get help from others. We followed all the correct steps, but the problem persisted. My grandfather noticed it, inquired about it, and then came in person to fix it, but it wasn't easy to resolve. Removing the authorized user and blocking withdrawals all took time, procedures, and in some cases, cooperation from both account holders, which is the main objective. The money was still moving inside the door, which someone had left open in its sleeve. Then Trevor said something that made my blood run cold. Someone had called the bank and told them that a power of attorney would be arriving in my mother's name, so they would be ready to execute it when the document arrived. The document itself hadn't been signed yet, but the groundwork was laid. Every boundary wall had already been drawn. All that remained was to sign it. I politely asked Walter if he had signed anything. He hadn't. They weren't waiting for him at the bank. They were waiting for him at the party, surrounded by people. We got the copy. We changed the address again. But I realized the trap was no longer a plan, so I left that bank. It was already half built. That night, I went looking for the stranger's high heels. It didn't take me long. Her name was Renata Paul, and she described herself as an elderly care consultant, which was exactly what she needed after all. She wasn't a lawyer, nor was she a licensed social worker. She was a notary who ran a side business helping families move. The feedback I received was quite clear. She was an expert at getting elderly people to check out quickly before any family member could enter the room, which might be undesirable. One family reported that they entered while their father was taking painkillers, and he was only given his autopsy an hour later. I worked on each case. It was part of every transition I oversaw. For Renata, her grandfather wasn't just a person, he was a figure of great importance. The more she read, the more she understood what her mother and Gerald had brought together. Paula brought faith, that gentle girl who always said it was all for her father's good. Gerald brought purpose and documents. And Renata brought the machine that transformed the old man's bewilderment, whether real or feigned, into legal language. 3 people, 3 jobs, 1 goal. I put my laptop down and found the listing that made me look at the wall. Renata's online booking page showed a long-awaited appointment for my grandmother's birthday afternoon. The client's name wasn't mentioned, just Saturday drawing session. Otherwise, my grandmother would have booked it. My mother had just been contacted about the invitation she mentioned. It didn't take long for them to uncover the truth. They hadn't just used the party as a cover, they had meticulously planned it. They surrounded him with loved ones, presented him with cake and 80 balloons, and made him feel safe and loved. Then, when he signed, they displayed the documents for everyone to see, so that half the town could witness that he had done so willingly and of his own free will. He was intelligent. He was patient. He was the most remarkable person I have ever seen. He arrived on Thursday. I drove my grandfather to Dr. H's clinic and sat in the waiting room while a very attentive man asked me a series of precise questions for about 2 hours. When they left, Dr. H looked at me over his glasses and said quite plainly that Walter was one of the most intelligent people in their 80s he had seen in years. He was very focused, had a sharp memory, and a wonderful sense of humor. He wrote everything down, set a date, and meticulously drew the wall Ruth had asked me to build. My grandfather seemed quietly satisfied, like a man who had just put a penny in a filing cabinet. But what he did next in the car is something I'll never forget. He reached into the canvas bag he'd brought and placed an old metal can with a soft lid, which had been open for years, on my lap. It was my grandfather's letter. "We'll find him now," he said. I asked him what was inside. He opened the letter and said he had only read it at first. His hands were still on his knees. His voice was quiet, but his eyes were shining, and I knew that this quiet, capable man had been carrying a heavy burden for a long time and had finally decided to lighten some of it. I always carried that metal box, that cold metal, in my sleeve, and it held something that haunted me more than any legal document. It was something I could hold on to. Whatever happened next, whatever my mother tried at that party, I had a medical report that proved he knew my grandfather's identity. My grandfather's box was on my lap, and the name and number were written in his clean handwriting. The wall was crumbling, but the contents hadn't been filed yet. They were in that box. That night, I opened the metal box on my kitchen table. On top of it was a handwritten letter, written a few weeks before my grandmother died, when I was still studying nursing. Nora Rohr knew her time was running out, so she used some of it to write about the future. The letter wasn't just for me, it was for the family to read if needed. She wrote about how she'd seen money destroy other families she knew, how inheritances had turned siblings into strangers. She wrote that she was afraid this would happen to her too. Then she wrote a sentence about Paula. She knew my mother felt rejected. Paula wrote that she spent her childhood believing that Walter loved the memorial, the church, and the whole city more than his own child. That some of the pain was real, some of it was just a story Paula told herself, and that both kinds of pain can corrupt a person from the inside out. My grandmother wrote, "Please, don't let money define us." At the bottom of the letter was the reason behind everything that had happened. It was my grandmother's first will and testament, stipulating that the house was not to be sold or given away to anyone. Instead, it was to fund a nursing scholarship in my grandmother's name, to send young women like me to school, just as Nora had always wished. The house was never meant to be sold. It was meant to send nurses to the school in her name. I sat there for a long time, hearing my mother's voice in my head, but he only remembered it at Christmas. And I thought he was just being kind. The doctor wrote it down. My grandmother left the reason in the biscuit tin. I now had to make sure the entire city was aware of it. On Friday, I filed the report with the Adult Protective Services. I sat down with the receptionist and carefully filed it as if it were a medical check or a letter of recommendation, along with a printed copy confirming the withdrawal of $18,000. The authorized beneficiary's name, power of attorney, Renata Paul's appointment date, and date of birth were all recorded, and the doctor's competency rating was verified. I made no alterations. I didn't call my mother by name. Instead, I explained what had happened because only the details of what had happened could trigger bureaucratic procedures. I called the National Senior Citizen Fraud Hotline for guidance, and the operator patiently told me what to expect and what my grandmother's rights were, including that anyone acting on her behalf could legally be required to provide every dollar in writing. I did everything myself, phone call after phone call, form after form. No one beat me to it. I built everything on my own overnight between shifts. The social worker took it very seriously. She said she would open an investigation. Then she said what I had feared. "These things take time, Miss Overton. We have to question everyone and look at the records. It will take weeks to uncover the truth." I told her about the invitation, the signing that afternoon, and the trap disguised as a party. Her expression softened, but she told the truth. She couldn't promise me the investigation would be over sooner. The state was moving at a snail's pace. I returned home, knowing that the justice system, however realistic it seemed, couldn't save him at that party. If my grandfather had thought of defending himself, it would have happened in the living room in front of everyone, and I would have had to do it. My mother found out about the doctor. I don't know how. Maybe the office called to confirm. Maybe Gerald had a contact. Maybe she felt like the ground was shaking beneath her. He called me on Saturday, and this time there was nothing. "What do you do?" she said in a faint, trembling voice, leading him to the doctor behind her, looking at the bill. "Do you know how I feel?" I told her I knew exactly how I felt. She was talking about me. She called me a troublemaker. She said I was tearing my family apart. I always thought I was better than everyone else. A true daughter trusts her mother. And that's it. The oldest weapon in her arsenal. The weapon that's been with me my whole life. Guilt. I was always struck at my weak spot, the one where I felt hopeless. "You're hurting your family. You're selfish. Just shut up and everything will be all right." For 34 years, that sentence stuck in my head. I waited for the moment of change, but it never came. Something inside me finally hardened, like cement hardening overnight. "I won't argue with you, Mom," I said, my voice quieter than ever. "I love my grandmother, and I won't be silenced." She too fell silent, shocked, because I'd never refused her anything in my life, and I'd thought about it deeply. Then she whispered that I was sorry, and I hung up. I stood in the kitchen, the missing phone in my hand, my heart pounding. Under the weight of fear, I felt something I hadn't felt in her presence for decades, a sense of stability. I apologized for 34 years, hoping for peace, but it was no use that day. If you stop hiding who loves you, you'll only know when you're silent. The hardest part is yet to come. Click subscribe and follow me. Then I acted quickly. In one day, I changed the security locks at my grandmother's house. She described herself to her family as a loving daughter protecting a defenseless man from her cunning sister. She recounted to them what had happened in the past, saying that she was the one who had done it, that she had been behind the house, and that she had found her sister when she took her to the doctor and stole the money. They agreed with her. On Sunday, 2 of my cousins didn't reply to my messages. They restricted who could see them, and she blocked my calls. I couldn't reach my grandfather for 2 days. That silence was the worst part of the ordeal. I stayed awake in that house alone with the new lock, wondering if he thought I'd abandoned him, if he thought I'd given up. I want to be fair because he taught me that. Back then, there was a period that made everything complicated. I was driving home from work when I saw my mother sitting in the garden, her face in her hands, crying. She cried a lot, as she usually did when no one was watching. I realized immediately that some of this fear was real. Gerald's business had failed, and he'd seized their savings. They were closer to losing their home than anyone could have imagined. She didn't look like a cartoon character. She was a frightened woman convincing herself that taking over her father's house early was the only way to reclaim what could have been hers. I felt an intense, unwanted sympathy. Then I remembered the voice that had asked about the garden and the poetry, and the pity it had shown me when it said it wouldn't remember them until Christmas. That's when the sympathy reached its peak. Scared, not regretful. I reached him through the only door my mother couldn't close. My job. My friend from work, Denise, a home care assistant with a legal form, a certificate, and a rating board, had every right to check on the well-being of an elderly client. My grandfather called and requested medical attention. It was his right, and my mother couldn't refuse without sounding just like her. Denise went, performed a thorough examination, and then called me from her car. He was healthy, calm, clear-headed, eating well, and his eyes were as clear as more than half of her patients. He sent a message through her. He was waiting for the divorce. He did something secretly with Ruth Delgado before changing the locks. He voluntarily and publicly signed a limited power of attorney with an independent witness, giving Ruth the right to act on his behalf in financial matters, not a power of attorney that gave her the right to act on his behalf in her life. On the contrary, it was a narrow, calculated strategy to protect his account by exercising complete self-control. He was preparing his countermove while I was preparing mine. Then I realized that all along I had thought I was saving him. The truth was more like a partnership. I wasn't saving a helpless old man. He was competent. He chose his partner, gathered the paperwork, and set the date. When the time came, he thought I was the right person. Denise passed him another line, and it was Walter. Tell Sammy not to worry about the invitation. Tell her to bring their paperwork. After we ended the call, I sat in the parking lot and laughed for the first time in a week. It was no longer a secret. Neither of us was. We were ready to go public. The following week, things became clear, and none of it came from nowhere. I want to make this clear because it's important. No mysterious savior appeared. At the last minute, the required documents failed to appear. Everyone who stood by my grandmother had deliberately and painstakingly located them. Her lawyer, Ruth, was ready with the documents and powers of attorney she had granted her. Dr. Haley, the Adult Protective Services officer, whose assessment had been a shield for me, and whose meticulous investigation lent credibility to the entire case, even though it wasn't completed on time, was also crucial. Denise was able to talk about the real situation in a professional manner. I met with Ruth for planning, and she gave me some of the most important advice I received during this difficult experience. She said, "You can't simply accuse your mother. If you stand up and accuse her of stealing, what you say to her is what your child will say to your mother, and half of it will reflect back on you. You have to let her speak. Let her present the documents. Let her make her case. Then, when you're committed to everyone, put the facts on the table. Facts, not emotions. Documents, not shouting." Again, laid out like cards, there were no similarities. My mother's strength was performance, so we push her to her limits and then compare the performance with the evidence. I asked Ruth if she was coming to the party. She smiled. I didn't miss it. That night I called my grandfather, and for the first time since all this began, I heard him laugh. A real laugh. Let them light the candles. Let them sing. Then Sam said, "Let's turn everything off. We have 6 days." I spent those 6 days organizing the files. Nothing exciting, just a standard file. But I arranged it as if I were preparing a patient's file for a family reunion. The file told the story of a person's entire life. At the top was Dr. Bauer's eligibility assessment, dated, signed, and clearly legible. Then, a bank statement showing $18,000 was highlighted, and Gerald's information was added as the authorized user. He then confirmed that Adult Protective Services had begun an investigation. Then there were the papers concerning Pranata Paul, the lack of a genuine will, the structure of her committee, her birthday dates, and, at the bottom of the page, the two most important things: my grandmother's letter and the original will, and the house mortgaged in Nora's name for a nursing scholarship. I thought long and hard about whether I should record anything at the party, and decided against it. It would have been so easy to hide the phone and catch Mom talking nonsense. But it would have eased my anxiety a little when she was talking about the unexpected instead of the truth. My grandfather chose the path of honesty at every turn, acting like a detective solving a real crime, without distorting the evidence, but simply stating the facts. I would have done the same. Everything in that file was genuine, properly protected, and capable of standing up in any court. That's what set us apart from them. They thought about appearances, while we thought about reality. The night before the party, I laid everything on the bed and reviewed it again, as if I were reviewing a search warrant, because correctness alone is not enough with negligence. Then maintain the silence you use in the worst bed. State the truth clearly. Say it once. Then forget about it. 2 days later, I learned the rest of their plan, because Renata Paul was careless with her plans. And finally my cousin, who replied to my messages, told me what my mother had said in the family group chat, from which I had been silently excluded. The ceremony was even more horrific than I had imagined. After the cake, at the reception, my mother gathered everyone and gave a speech about how difficult it had been for her, how much she loved her father, how his memory was failing, and how someone had to intervene. Then, calmly and tenderly, in front of the priest, the neighbors, and his entire family, she asked him to sign a power of attorney so that everyone would see that the decision was his. Renata stood there, pen in hand, watching. The audience wasn't random, it was all a strategy. If 40 people saw a sweet girl helping her flustered father sign a document, someone would later tell her she looked beautiful. Laughter. She was grooming witnesses for her crime. My cousin whispered that they had invited the vicar and some of Walter's elderly neighbors, particularly the influential ones in Belle Haven. My mother had already considered the overall picture of the guest list. I hung up and sat with her, and instead of feeling apprehensive, I felt something more certain. She had arranged for a hall full of witnesses to bless her. Good. A hall filled with witnesses from both sides opened. She was ready to present her case to those who wanted to hear the truth, with a priest testifying on her behalf and neighbors who remembered her. She thought the court was on her side. In reality, she had just formed my jury. The night before the ceremony, I had a long conversation with my grandmother. He was calm as he studied me. We discussed what would happen, who would say what, and when I would open the file. He told me not to think about the hardest part, making the decision, as if it were already over. Then he said something that connected everything from the beginning until the day I walked out the door. Do you remember what I said? Go in. Get out now. I told you, I'll never forget this. This was the last time you'll have to hide from your mother. I said, you won't be hiding tomorrow. Tomorrow you'll be somewhere everyone can see. I had to press the phone hard against my ear so I wouldn't hear the sound of myself drowning. Then he said something else, and I felt both frightened and bewildered. He had thought me naive for once. As my mother began to speak, while Ranata took out the papers, he sat there like a bewildered, utterly helpless little father, letting Paula listen to him with rapt attention. He allowed her to say everything in front of all the guests before she left. I want you to tell them who she is before they know who I am. He said it's a disaster. If something goes wrong with the schedule, or if it falls through, or if someone rushes to sign, we could lose. But it's his decision, his life, his home, and he deserves to see it all through. There's one last offer, and I can hear his weary smile. So Sam, we didn't have to pretend, neither I nor I. I didn't sleep, and I didn't think so either. The party was more like love. That was the worst part. When I arrived at my grandmother's house that afternoon, the locks had been changed, so my key didn't work, and I had to go in as a guest. It was warm and bright and crowded. A man hung 80 golden balloons in the living room. His name was written on them in blue. A table was laden with pastries. The neighbors were laughing. The priest was shaking hands. And amidst all this, my mother was smiling and playing her part in life. A dutiful daughter. She moved around the room, waving her hands, confessing her regrets, and muttering about how difficult it was to see her father fall, but how lucky she was to be taking care of him. It was a very quiet show, but it disgusted me, because now I understood its true nature. This heat, this crowd, this scene of love, that was the place. Neither home nor money was what she had always aspired to. This image, this good girl, was admired by everyone in the city for bearing the burden of her father's tragic loss. Gerald stood leaning against the wall, an unsold drink in his hand, looking towards the door. Near the corridor, away from the throng of guests, Renata Paul stood, wearing a smart jacket and carrying a delicate leather bag under her arm, waiting her turn. My grandfather sat in a chair by the window, small and unassuming, letting his neighbor stroke his hand. He didn't see me. He was in a daze, and he'd already played his part. I sat by the stove, the usual file of papers beside me, and forced myself to breathe. Then my mother picked up a fork and banged it hard on the wine glass, and silence fell over the room. Guys, she said, I have a message for Dad. It was wonderful, I have to admit it. She stood in the middle of the room, tears welling up at the perfect moment. She told the story she'd made up for herself, how her father had suffered, how he'd forgotten so much, how confused he was, no longer able to cope the way he used to, how he'd broken her heart, but one must protect oneself from deception, from wrong decisions, and from oneself. Some of the elderly neighbors nodded, their faces filled with sympathy. She said she had spoken to a wonderful counselor who specialized in helping families with such matters. She gestured, and Ranatha stepped forward, holding a leaflet and offering a warm, professional smile. Today, my mother said, you are all here, our family, so there are no secrets between us. My father would publicly relinquish my financial rights to make it appear to everyone that it was his will. He was clever. He orchestrated the theft in a clear and straightforward manner. Renata returned the leaflet to the coffee table, arranged the papers, and opened his pen. My grandfather looked at the bewildered, tearful eyes in the chair and asked in a quiet voice if it was time to prepare the cake. The audience laughed quietly, and I saw 40 people enjoying the story of the poor, bewildered old man and his faithful son. Renata pointed to the pen and said softly, "Here, Walter, I'm right on the line." My mother smiled. Gerald leaned against the wall. This was the moment when everything was signed in front of the witnesses. The crime seemed like a blessing. I felt ready to see every eye in the room sign. I put down my drink and headed to the middle of the hall. Before my grandfather signed anything, I said, "I think everyone here needs to hear a few things first." My voice sounded calm, not loud. Over the years, I'd learned to speak softly in rooms full of frightened families, and the practice had paid off. The room turned toward me. Though my mother's smile remained unchanged, her eyes were now rigid and resolute. Samantha spoke passionately to the crowd, warning them from below. "This isn't the time." "This is exactly the time," I said. "You said you wanted it done publicly, in front of everyone. Fine, let's do it publicly." I could feel the audience's interest growing. That shift happens when people sense the scene is about to become something real. Renata stopped, still suspended in midair. Gerald clenched his jaw. My mother took a step closer and lowered her voice to that low, sharp tone only her family could hear. "You're embarrassing yourself." I took a deep breath. I sat down. The old urge to bow and apologize resurfaced one last time, to dispel the anxiety. I walked past her and glanced at my grandfather, who was sitting in a chair and looking back at me. His tears had dried. Then I looked at my mother and didn't sit down. "I'm a nurse, Mum," I said, calming down as the water settled in my mouth. "I take care of people the age of my grandmother every day, and I know exactly what it means to be considered missing." Then I turned to speak not to her now, but to the priest, the neighbors, and the relatives who were in the room. "You've all come here to celebrate his 80th birthday. So, before any of you writes to ruin his life, you should know who he is and what happened in this house." The quieter it got, the more cramped the room felt. My mother had planned to speak privately. Now I had the floor. I opened the file and flipped through the pages, one by one, a way to build something solid and indisputable. I placed the first page on the coffee table next to Renata's papers and said it was a comprehensive cognitive assessment. It had been written 3 days earlier by Dr. Hill, a geriatrician. The report stated that my grandfather was mentally sound, had a good memory, good judgment, and was fully capable of managing his affairs. His presence filled the room. My mother's story was based on a lawsuit, and I've placed a doctor's signature in the middle. This, as I'll show you on the next page, is his bank statement for the past 3 months. He withdrew $18,000 that he never spent. And this document lists Gerald as the authorized beneficiary on the account. The woman did it in a rather infamous way. I nodded to Rana, and she calmed down a little. This was a message from the Adult Protective Services, confirming an investigation into Walter Rohr's financial exploitation. The word assault suddenly entered the room. The priest paused. Jiran exchanged glances. Then I continued quietly. "And this woman with the pen is Renata Tsunghi. She's not a lawyer, and she's not a social worker. She's a notary public who charges elderly people fees to get documents signed quickly before their families object. She has an appointment this afternoon on her birthday." I left. I never raised my voice, and I never called my mother a thief. I continued recounting the facts one by one at the table until the heartwarming story she was telling before the assembled witnesses crumbled. Renata slowly replaced her pen cap and took the paper from the table. The neighbors saw the bewildered old man. They looked at my mother, and she began to breathe rapidly. At first, Renata tried to salvage her reputation, as people do when a deal falls through. "Everything I'm doing is perfectly legal," she said, adjusting her jacket and seeking professional stability. "The family asked for my services." Then a new voice from the doorway said, "There's nothing illegal about encouraging a qualified person to sign a property sale contract." Ruth Delgado entered the room, her hair disheveled and her lawyerly composure filling the space. "I am Mr. Rohr's lawyer," she said. "He was fully qualified 2 weeks ago, but knowing what was coming, he gave me some authority to testify on his behalf." Mrs. Paul, perhaps you should speak to your lawyer before you say another word. Renata remained silent. She took her bag and vanished without a sound. That's how it is with those who treat their lives like business transactions. They disappear when the transaction becomes dangerous. Then they all looked at Gerald. He was still standing on the wall, but his faith had weakened and he had left little behind. 18,000 people logged into a single account, Gerald said quietly. Your company closed in the spring. You closed your house. I didn't expect it. It was all documented. He opened his mouth, found nothing, then closed it again. All that machinery my mother had built, the consultant, the financier, the machine, collapsed and fell silent within 5 minutes because nothing can withstand the sunlight. That was always the difference. Their whole plan was vague and confusing. No one needed to scrutinize it. As soon as the truth was revealed to the witnesses, she collapsed under its weight. Only my mother remained in the middle of the room while the whole village watched. Then my grandfather stood up. He did so slowly, but not as if he were weak on his feet. He rose like a judge, and as he did, the fog completely vanished from his face. Everyone in the room noticed the change immediately. The bewildered old man who had been holding them back for the past 20 minutes was gone, replaced by Walter Rohr, a 40-year-old accountant, still as sharp-witted as he was on his retirement day, said in a quiet voice, "I want to say something at my wedding." Complete silence fell over the room. I'm not confused. I don't understand. For months I knew what was going on in my daughter and her husband's minds, and I made them think I was wrong, so instead of telling them everything separately, they told me everything. He looked at the neighbors, the priest, and the cousins. I told my sister to hide in the kitchen the day they brought those documents so she could hear and believe it. Everything she told you is true. I am of sound mind. Dr. Power will confirm that. And nothing will be signed in this house today. One of the neighbors almost laughed. There was a mixture of relief and surprise. My grandfather turned to me, and for a moment the accountant looked at the grandfather who had placed the pieces of cake for me. Then he looked at his son. I walked over to him calmly and said what needed to be said to the woman who had started all this. Nobody signs anything these days. Mother, it's all over. Then Mother broke down. The warmth, the polished performances, the weeks of polished romance all vanished. What emerged was cruel, brutal, and hideous. You have no idea what I've left for this family, she cried, her head bouncing around the room. For 40 years, I stood in its shadow, pouring everything I had into the memorial, into it and into the guests, and I found nothing. Nothing. She pointed to my grandmother, then to me. And now that I'm alone, you are all here judging me. Her voice was audible and broken. You are all against me. It was a coup that had begun, and I felt it coming. The wicked man in the room was no longer a bewildered old man who had been robbed, but was berating a woman who had blamed her father for reaching 80 years of age in front of the priest he had summoned to corroborate her claim. His voice grew louder, while I remained silent. I want you to understand that I didn't shout again, nor did I applaud. It wasn't necessary. I stood beside my grandfather and let him go. Every word he spoke confirmed everything I had written on that table, and the whole town had watched him confirm it. When he finally came out, panting, trembling, applying eyeshadow, there was a profound silence in the house. I said to him in a low voice, "Go inside, get out of here now." She looked at me, not understanding. That's what my grandmother told me the day you came to take her home. I hid, I listened, I heard everything. I let it go. I wasn't hiding anymore, and neither was she. She had no answer. And for the first time in my life, my mother had nothing to say to me. I added the file one last time, and the doctor. I began to reassess authority, and this time I treated it as a reality, not as a tool. My mother said something that had weighed on my chest for weeks during our first meeting, and it was time to respond to her. I said slowly enough for everyone to catch their breath and hear me. I told them they wouldn't even remember Christmas. You said it as if it wasn't a problem. I left the page in front of her. I reminded her of this holiday and the holidays that followed. She saw the newspaper, the doctor's signature, her father standing next to me, smiling, and finally realized that this had really happened. The vicar, who had known the family for 30 years, stepped forward, gently placed his hand on her arm and politely asked if she would like to go out with him. She made her way to the door, past 80 golden balloons, an untouched cake with Walter's name written on it in blue frosting, and neighbors who preferred not to look directly at her. Gerald slipped out. She stood by the door and glanced at her father. I don't know what she wanted to see. Whatever it was, she didn't understand. Then the door closed behind her with a click, and silence filled the house my grandfather had built. Once again. He took a deep breath, and his shoulders slumped for the first time in months. Well, who wants cake? He said to the crowd with a faint, dry smile. For some reason, perhaps, some laughed, and everyone else breathed a sigh of relief. The next few weeks were quieter than you might imagine, because the truth is, once he was out, he didn't need much fanfare. The Adult Protective Services concluded its investigation and confirmed the validity of the file. The pending power of attorney was revoked before it could be executed. With Ruth's assistance and the bank's cooperation, most of the $18,000 was recovered and withdrawn from Gerald's account. Renata Paul was reported to the state and the Board of Notaries Public Licensing, as well as to the Fraud Prevention Hotline, which keeps a record of people who dealt with her. I later learned that she had stopped accepting new clients nationwide, which was closer to justice than anyone else. Gerald, having lost his job and no longer having easy money to offer, didn't last long because he had nothing to take. My mother wasn't arrested. My grandmother could have crushed her. Ruth admitted it, but he decided against it. She's still my daughter, he said, tired yet confident. I don't want her in the classroom. I want her away from my books. And that's what happened. She lost her right to money and work. And because Belhaven was a small town, and everyone at that party had a good reputation, she lost the image she had dedicated her life to building. The story of what happened spread faster than it was told. It turned out that the determined girl was the same woman who had tried to steal from her father on his birthday. Of course, she was hurt by this. She was terrified of losing him, so she gave in for her own sake. My grandfather lived in the house, in the garden, and the real key was in his pocket. What my grandmother had longed for, what she had waited for in her cookie jar for years, had finally come true. Just as she had dreamed, we established the Nora Rayburn Nursing Scholarship and sent young women to nursing school in her name. My grandmother asked me to run the class, and before he could finish his sentence, I agreed. For me, something in that room changed the course of my life. I entered it as a nurse who had remained silent for 34 years, and I left knowing that silence protects no one. So I began volunteering with an elderly rights organization, sitting with them in offices and courtrooms, adding my voice to the file full of facts that needed to be documented for my grandmother, and I remained silent. What I was most ashamed of, my desire to possess what wasn't mine, became a perfect tool when I directed it toward those who needed it. My grandmother wanted the household to send nurses to the school, and finally, she sent them somewhere. If there's one thing I learned sitting behind that cupboard, standing in the middle of the living room, it's this. Protecting those who raised us isn't betrayal. It's remaining silent when they're being robbed. And so, a whisper becomes an act. The hidden niece, the silent nurse, the Christmas that saved the home. If someone you love is forced to sign something you don't understand, don't wait. Ask. Make notes. Call. Please share this post so it reaches those who need it. Let me know in the comments if you need to defend your family, and subscribe to the heartwarming drama stories.